Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the set of workshops for the final chapter of the course. Very happy to see some familiar faces and names here. Thank you very much to Frank Hoffer for joining us. Frank is the non-executive director of the GLU Online Academy. In this chapter, he had an interesting video about trade preferences and how they could be made to work for workers. And today we're going to hear more from Frank on this and then engage in a conversation with you in the workshop. Questions you may have or comments, please either type your question in the chat section by saying where you're from, or take the floor, raise your hand in advance, use the application in the platform to raise your hand, and then we'll give you the floor. So thank you very much. Frank, over to you, and thanks a lot for finding time for this.
Yeah, thank you, Elira, and good morning or good afternoon to everybody. I want to structure this today that we have enough time of questions and discussions, because I would be very interested also to hear your opinion about the kind of proposal I flagged in that talk. I assume you have seen the talk, but just to getting back to some of the key points of it is that there is a set of trade preferences, in particular applying to the least developed countries, which have the supposed intention to help these countries to catch up economically, to grow their economy by giving them free access to the markets in Europe or in the US. And in the case of the lecture I did, it's about the European program of everything but arms. So the idea is countries can basically export everything to the EU free of tariffs. And in a textbook world, that would mean, yes, these countries then have the opportunity to have a price advantage against other countries, and therefore their market can grow faster and they can make substantial profits because they can basically pocket the tariff margin to grow their industries. Now, when I looked at the garment industry, it turns out that in reality, things are working a bit differently. In reality, what happens is that you have, or the way prices are calculated in the garment industry is basically that the big brands are coming to the countries and say, if you want to do a shirt like this, we know what's the price of the cotton, and we know what the price of all the accessories, and we know how many minutes a woman should use to sew that shirt, and we know what's your wage rate, and then we can calculate the price. And they set the prices. So, and if they say, okay, the price you get, they would basically say, okay, but if you want to have a higher tariffs, we have no reason to do this, because we can also go to another country which has the same EBA preferences. So we can move from Bangladesh to Myanmar, or from Myanmar to Cambodia, and we can get the lowest price. And there has been some research that 2/3 of the tariff margins actually do not end with the country of producing it, but they end with either the consumers or with the big buyers who have the market power to do so. So what we were thinking was, what needs to change if the trade preferences really translate into something which serves the country and the workers? And it should mean that a country which has this disadvantage should meet the requirement that the benefits are not only staying with the producers or the buyers, but the benefits workers. And the brands who are always saying they're interested in fair remuneration should be part of that. And the simple mechanism would be to say, you only get the full preferences, which are 12% in the EU case, if you increase the wages every year by, let's say, 5%. And if you don't do it, your preferences are reduced by 1 percentage point. What that means is basically that the countries would have to choose. If we want to get the full preferences, part of the benefits we get from there, we have to give to our workers through wage increases. And brands could not go to another country and say, okay, you don't increase the wages, so I buy there, because if they would buy from another country which doesn't increase the wages, there would be higher tariffs. So the choice would be then for producers and countries to give the money to workers or to the EU. Obviously, it would hit the profit margin of international brands who are in the moment pocketing a lot of the EVA preferences. So that's basically the proposal. It would be extremely heavy lifting to change trade rules. As you know, changing trade rules is often an exercise that takes years. But we thought it could be a starting point in a discussion among trade unionists and others to say, if we really want to use these trade preferences as developmental tools which serve the workers, that's the way to go about it. And the fascinating thing about such an approach is that you would deal on it on a sectoral level, on the level of the industry as a whole, and not of an individual company, because individual companies will always say, oh, sorry, we can't do it because competition doesn't allow us to do this. So that's basically the idea in the little video. And yeah, I would like to hear what you think about it, or whether you have questions about the proposal. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Frank. There were a few moments in which the quality kind of got bad, but I think it came through all right, the message. So over to you. Who would like to take the floor? Please introduce yourself if you would want to do so. You can make a question, a comment, or just a discussion on the thesis that Frank is putting forward.
Just give me 2 minutes. I switch to another.
Anybody wants to take the floor? You can take it, because it will take Frank just a couple of minutes to...
No, I'm fine now.
You good?
Yeah.
Okay. Frank, while we wait perhaps for somebody to make a question, because I don't see any hands raised, can you tell us to what extent, whether you see this proposal that you making here somehow reflected in the discussion that is happening at the EU level about the due diligence law? Is there any nuance of this proposal in those conversations?
Well, we shared that proposal obviously with the president of Industrial, which is the global trade union federation representing garment workers, and he was very positive about it. Not surprisingly, that the union side is positive about it. I think that the European discussion about a due diligence law is still very much focused on looking how individual companies can do their due diligence, that they're not violating human rights. And they have not really focused on an issue how to reduce the overall competitive pressure in the market. And my fear is that if we can't find about instruments reducing the competitive pressure and creating a level playing field at a higher level for wages, the due diligence discussion will focus too much on processes, what companies should do and too little on outcomes. I think that's a bit of a problem in the European discussion, and also in my thinking in the discussion in the case of the German Lieferkettengesetz. And international brands, the big ones, they're very good to demonstrate that they do a good process, and they do. But what does a good process help if it doesn't change the outcomes?
Somebody would like to take the floor? Lai, yes, please.
Good day, comrades. My name is Lai Brown from Nigeria. But actually, I have a question and equally comments. I'm not sure if I'm being heard. Can you hear me clearly?
It's not very clear, but if you can speak slowly and go to the question, because the quality is not extremely good.
Okay, fine. Well, actually, I didn't really catch the facilitator very well at the earlier stage, but I'm sure I'm talking about which work for workers, right? I heard him talking about free access to markets, particularly for developing economies, developing countries. Like, but the thing is that my question is, what is the impact of that proposal? Like, what is the impact of that to the workers whom are the downstream of the global supply chains? I mean, like, what's the impact of that particular proposal on workers? Because in my own opinion, I think that in such proposal, we create a backdoor for the big corporations and multinationals to amass more wealth at the detriment of the workers, in a sense. Because bulk of the raw materials, bulk of the materials they use. Bulk of the work, the work is being done in the developing countries. So, after access to so if we create a free access to markets for the developing countries, it is the big corporations that we have such opportunity to move the market from the poor and developing countries into probably into the EU and the rest, to be the big corporation that will benefit from this. I think, in my opinion, I think one thing that we can, one lesson we can draw from this whole
it's very hard to understand. I don't know whether, Frank, you're able to pick up something.
I think, Lai, if I got you right, I think you're pointing to a number of very important issues. I think one is the question of open markets in what direction. I think one question is whether a developing country has to open its market or whether it has free access to the market in Europe or in the US. The difference between a free trade agreement and the special trade preferences like the Everything But Arms is that they offer free access to the European market without necessarily demanding that developing countries open up their markets in the same way. So that there's a bit of a difference. The second point I think you pointed out is that far too much of the products developing countries are then exporting to the European Union are commodities and not manufactured goods. And if you recall the lecture Niva Mkhatla did from South Africa, she exactly pointed out in that lecture that there's a big difference between most parts of Africa and Latin America, which are exporting largely commodities to the north, and to some South and Southeast Asian countries where you have a certain amount of labor-intensive manufacturing. Well, how they went into let's say, into global trade. And obviously, only if you start to build a manufacturing base and you not only have a low wage, low efficiency manufacturing base, but you are upgrading, the trade will help you to develop. If it is just that big brands come and taking the oil or the iron ore or whatever out of your country, the spillover effect is very little. And the experience is also that the rent seeking in countries is very high. So a small group of people in countries normally, in conjunction with the brands, benefit from that. So I think that's two different discussions really. And what I was focusing on was actually more on the manufacturing side than what you were raising, the commodity export side, and more the point that in principle giving poor countries free trade access, that it becomes attractive to locate industry in their countries, is, I think, a positive instrument. What you have to do is basically you have then to make sure that the benefits you give the countries are actually staying in the country. And the best way to do this is to say, okay, if you get this huge subsidy, you must be able to pay higher wages than you would be able if you wouldn't get this subsidies. And if the wages stay in the country, you have all the positive spillover effects for an economy. So you have, if people have more money in the pocket, normally the first thing they do is they improve their nutrition. So you have less people who are sick. You have fewer children who don't grow properly because they're not properly nurtured. And the next thing normally parents do, they invest in the education of their children. So you have this, from the family income, you have positive direct development effects. And secondly, if people have more money to spend, they also create markets internally in their country. And an export-led industry with the garment industry, which is by far the biggest export industry in the poor developed countries, should contribute to building a stronger developmental base through these structures in their countries. And we have to start the discussion that what the EBA is supposed to do, I mean, it's designed for doing that, for helping development, is not doing this in the moment because the profits are siphoned off largely by international brands who use that at getting products at an even lower price. I'm not sure whether I fully answered your question because I guessed a bit what you wanted to say because the connection was a bit poor.
But I already sent a message to Lai that if there is anything that we missed in this end, please type your question in the chat box and we'll take it there. Thanks a lot, Frank. Somebody would want to take the floor? Aziz, yes, please.
Hello, so my name is Aziz and I work for a French NGO called Human Resources Without Borders. This NGO is acting against forced labor and child labor. And I really like your idea on increasing, pushing the companies and the countries that benefited from the trade agreement to raise the workers' wages. Because I've been to Cambodia and I've been to Cambodia 2 years ago to study the labor situation in Cambodia. And it was just after the election, and some of the European Union members, they wanted to ban the Cambodia from this agreement. So my question is about the situation in Cambodia. What do you think about it? And what is the situation with the agreement in Cambodia? Thank you.
Yeah, just also for the others, currently the Everything But Arms agreement of the EU is conditional on respect for human and labor rights and democratic rights. And in Cambodia, the government outlawed the opposition party, put some opposition politicians in prison, took repressive measures on land issues to free land for sugar plantations, and also a number of independent trade unionists were fired or had to leave the country. So the the record on democracy and human rights is not very good, and so the EU started an inquiry process of destroying the preferences. And that process goes over 2 years with reports, consultations, and so on. But the Cambodian government basically said, no, it's all fine, our country, and we decide what we do. And so ultimately, the EU decided in February this year to withdraw for part of the garments the trade preference to the EU. You must know Cambodia, probably 40% of their exports goes to the EU. So it had economic repercussions for the country. How big they are, it is very difficult to say because the decision basically coincided with the COVID-19 crisis, which was a much more brutal shock on the global supply chains than whatever the trade preferences could be. The problem, I think, with the current system is it's either you withdraw the preferences or you keep the preferences, and you have not very simple yardsticks whether a country fulfills the requirements or not. The moment you would link this to something like wage developments, things would be much clearer to say, okay, if you don't deliver certain wage increases, you have a problem. And a lot of other problems which you have, in particular child labor, has the best chance to disappear if the wages for adults go up. I mean, that we know from ILO research about many years, you know, kids to school, parents to jobs. That's the answer to child labor. And so that would be my thinking on that. On the other hand, I think the EU at this point had no other choice because the government was unwilling, the Cambodian, to engage in the process to say, if we have certain conditions of human rights and democracy and you totally ignore it, we have to withdraw the preferences because otherwise no one would bother anymore to say that is a criteria for getting the trade preferences.
Thank you, Frank. Somebody else would like to make a question or a comment? Yes, Charles.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Charles Kumbi from the Democratic Republic of Congo. I have a question here. Let me take the case of Ethiopia in terms of textile industry. I know that Ethiopia doesn't have so far a minimum wage that is set by the government up until now, because I remembered sometime unions were having some debates through the SETU, which is the central the center of unions in Ethiopia. Now, my question is, when these free trade agreements are being concluded, definitely they are done between the European, Council and governments, these developing government from these developing countries. So now my question is that most of these companies, if all those companies that are involved in the textile manufacture from the supply chain, I mean, as we take the supply chain of the textile industry, most of these companies are private companies. So now I'm trying to think, how does this salary increase relate to the power of the government? Because to me, to my understanding, the agreement was signed by the government, but not with these private companies. So how can a government weigh on these companies and say, you need to increase or to improve your salaries? What will be, how can the government in fact weigh on it? Because these agreements are not signed between companies, but it's between government. So that's what I wanted to understand, which mechanism can be utilized by this government to make sure that the companies that are operating in their countries abide by the law, by the laws in a country where there is not even a minimum wage?
Charles, so very, very, very good question, and pretty much to the point of the challenges which are there. I mean, the first point is obviously, what are the kind of wage setting mechanisms we can think about? So the one is the minimum wage for the country. The second is a minimum wage for the sector. The third is for a government to say, we want the trade unions and an employers association to negotiate a wage for the sector. And as a government, we would then legally extend it to all employers in the sector. Or you don't need the legal extension because all the big employers are already right in the beginning part of the negotiating process. So I think that's the channels. Now, I know in Cambodia there's a discussion with the government, or was a discussion of the government about a minimum wage. And their problem is that if you have a countrywide minimum wage and you have the extreme poverty in Ethiopian villages, the level you set this will be far too low for a meaningful minimum wage in the garment sector. The second point is that currently the government of Ethiopia thinks that their competitive advantage of attracting production from Bangladesh and other countries is to have the lowest possible wages. You know that the wages in Ethiopia are half the wages in Bangladesh. That's why it would be so important to say, okay, you start with the wage, whatever you pay in the moment, but if you don't use the instruments I just described for moving towards wage growth as a government, then your trade preferences shrink. So you can't win further advantages vis-a-vis Bangladesh by keeping your wages low, because if you do this and you don't do wage growth, your trade preferences go down. The government can legislate a minimum wage. I think then they can extend a collective bargaining agreement. They can also talk, and if they do this, then all brands would have to follow these wages, and that would link up with what Alira said earlier with the due diligence. Then the due diligence requirement of any brand would require that going wage rate as a minimum is paid. And you could then also, as a union, as an international union movement, focus more clearly on brands who are violating this principle. Because at the moment, the problem is minimum wages are fixed very often at such a low level, and that it becomes a very convenient situation for brands where they say, yes, we do our due diligence, we pay the legal minimum wage, but if you take like a country in Vietnam, the legal minimum wage was, I think, 40 or 50% of what a garment worker was actually earning, because it was set so low. It's like the legal minimum wage, Jiffit, I think in the US, it's $7.50 or whatever, right? So no one gets it. So everybody can say, yes, I pay the minimum wage, but any wage you want to live on in the US probably has to be, I don't know, $15 or whatever. So then it's easy to say, I've filled my due diligence to pay the minimum wage, but that's meaningless because the minimum wage is not meeting really any basic criteria.
Thank you. Any other question? Yes, Gifford, please.
Okay, I've met you before, but just to reintroduce myself, I live in San Francisco in the US. And around 2005, I was working in adult education at a worker center, teaching laid off garment workers who were mostly displaced because of the expiration of the multi-fiber agreement. So at the time we did some research, and at the time, you know, for our understanding is big players, brands like Walmart were pressuring the supply chain and pushing the kind of exploitation down the subcontracting supply chain and creating a system of almost no transparency. So Walmart might contract, well, I think they eventually did their own, but there were players like in Hong Kong, like Li and Feng, who would go contract in China, and it would create this just complete lack of transparency. Now, I don't know if I'm really wrapping my head around this, but I think one problem with the EBA might still be enforcement. Like what if they just hide? What if they just, the home workers, or they just keep subcontracting it away where whatever the real wage is, how could that enforcement be made transparent?
Look, I think transparency is a big issue. I think since Rana Plaza, which was the accident in Bangladesh some 6 years ago, transparency has improved. I mean, there are now big brands like H&M or PVH and so on who disclose their entire supply chain on the web. So you can find what are their suppliers. Secondly, I think the structure of the garment industry changed a bit. So you have more also suppliers who are greater entities. So also brands have an interest, because they need to be more transparent, to have also a bit of a shorter supply chain, right? Because they also lose track otherwise, but they can always be then now faced, look, in one of your suppliers, I found child labor, why didn't you do something like this? So I think transparency has improved. Certainly enforcement is a big issue, and that's why I personally think better than a minimum wage would be a collective bargaining agreement, which would be legally extended, because if you bargain collectively, at least you create with the union also an agent in the factories that might be a place where workers can organize and can demand that what is their right, that they also get this. So you get a bit more of a, what I almost call auditing from below, right? You have the people themselves who are saying what they want to do and what they need to get. That's also not easy in countries where it's sometimes a life-threatening exercise to be a trade unionist. So I'm totally with you that enforcement is a big issue. And if you get the right rules in place, and I think also if you go to the talk in this chapter with the colleagues from the global unions, I think they all very vividly make that case that enforcement is so crucial, and that for that you need to organize. But just, again, if you have an industry-wide collective bargaining agreement, there's a huge difference. So if you have the US situation in the moment, correct me if I'm wrong, but normally you have to organize in a factory, you have to get 50% to get recognition. So you have to have at least 70% of the workers signed up when you go for this, because the employer will put pressure and you will lose some people and so on. And then you start to bargain. Now, if you have an industry-wide agreement, you could go into a union, any factory where you have one member, and say, look, my one member has a right to get that salary. And whether we are fully organized or not, you are bound by the industry-wide agreement, because the government has said everybody's bound by the industry-wide agreement. And that's how it happens in countries like Austria or Belgium or South Africa. And through that way, it still requires courage of people to stake up for their rights, but you shift the balance of power a bit through that process. And it makes it easier, I think, for workers to come together and to demand their rights.
Some other questions, comments? We have Frank for 20 minutes more, so please exploit him. Yes, Charles, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if my video is quite better now because I'm having connection problems. All right.
We see you nice and bright.
Oh, that's good. Nice to hear that. Okay, look, now I'm going back to the case of what's happening in the DRC in terms of these collective bargainings and whatsoever. You know, the system itself in the DRC is quite different, whereby they don't look at which union is the majority at the company, but instead they have a different system whereby companies organize what they call trade unions or social elections. So during the social elections, the workers come and elect whatever union they think can do a better representation of the workers of the company, in such a way that they can be workers from a union, but they opt to elect another union to take over the leadership. So now when comes time to negotiate, they don't consider the union that has the majority of workers, but they consider the union that has won election, in such a way that most of those unions, I will tell you honestly, are mostly yellow unions. Why they win elections is because the employers use those unions during the campaign. They give them money to go and they do, you know, the campaign and win as much as they can of the voices. So they bribe, they buy presents, they buy food parcels during the election. So now when comes the collective bargaining time, they negotiate with the employer whom they are instead working for. So as a result, workers at the end of the day don't get really what they expected, because this union doesn't even consult workers before they go for bargaining agreements. We had a case like in one of the companies in the DRC. I'm very sorry to take quite some time, but I think it's a very interesting topic for the job that I do. We had a case in the DRC in one of the mining company, unfortunately not textile, but it's a mining company, whereby workers made their proposals. They wanted their salaries to increase to at least $500 because by then the prices of the minerals were booming and the company was not showing any interest in recognizing the work that is being produced by the workers when comes the booming time. Instead, they only go back to the workers when the price goes down. That's when they start reducing the salaries. So now workers said, no, now we are on the booming time. We want our salaries to be increased. So please, when we go to negotiate, this is what we want you to do. So they went there, but as I said, this union is a part of the yellow unions that is representing normally the workers after the elections. So they didn't negotiate anything good for the workers. And when they went back, the workers decided to go on strike. Now comes time for the government to intervene. They come and say, look, you are not authorized to go on strike. You are not authorized to go on strike because your strike is considered to be illegal, because the union that represents you doesn't recognize your strike. So you have to resume work or be fired. And the workers say, okay, we accept to be fired. As a result, you know, the DRC have been talking about this issue of artisanal mining. They said, if you don't, then we will join the artisanal mining, but we will come back into the company's area and start exploiting them so that we will fight with those who will still be your formal workers and us as artisanal workers. We see who will win the fight. So it became a sort of, you know, conflictual issues between the two camps, and 2 Chinese were killed as a result of this conflict, which was terrible. They were killed and burned, you know, alive in the middle of the city because of this conflict. So we were called on to go and try and mediate. So when we were called to mediate, now the company was also dealing in very bad faith, because, you know, you could see that the company was not willing to open up and try to increase the salaries based on the demands of the workers. So now I was like in the middle of a nowhere to go, you know. So the government on one side is not supporting these workers, and the company on the other side is also against the workers. Even the union that was supposed to represent them is standing on the employer's side. So I'm just asking, in such situation, based on the experience that you have from different countries, what can be the real approach from us as global unions having affiliates in these countries? Because, I mean, as I can tell you honestly, we were caught in the middle in such a way that even myself, I was called to the security department of the country to say that I'm inciting workers to violence. So I had to be trialed. I spent 2 days in custodies, and then after that I was released because of trying to make the company understand that whatever they are doing, all the profit that they are making, it's because these workers are working for the company to produce at the limit of the demand. So I'm just trying to find out what could have been the approach.
Look, Charles, I mean, you are describing a situation which is probably extremely bad, but it's not untypical, right? I mean, there is the attempt to create yellow unions by employers is as old as the history of the labor movement, right?
Yes.
I mean, they try to do this. And also the situation that governments come in against striking workers and saying, look, you haven't done it according to the rules is also quite familiar. And the point is very often, if you have a situation like you describe, at some point, workers will lose their patience and they're going to go on strike, whatever the rules are, and say, look, we have had it, right? I mean, and then you get the whole machinery of the state saying you haven't followed the rules and so on.
Yes.
Look, I think if I mean, you know the situation in your country much better, and it's very difficult to give any sort of advice, but I think there's certain experiences. First, if you have a multitude of trade unions, it is desirable at least to build some kind of joint bargaining councils among those unions who are for real, so that you not have different real unions competing for each other, or if you compete with each other, at least say vis-a-vis the employer, we build a kind of joint bargaining council so that we are somehow trying to get a coordinated approach there. The second question is obviously always, if you deal with international mining companies, who is the owner, where is the owner located, and who is the customer? I mean, there is a certain pressure, at least on the big car producers like BMW, VW, and Mercedes, and so if they are sourcing special metal which you use for batteries and things like that, right? That they have to prove that this doesn't come out of conflict areas and that there are certain standards met. So if you know who is the buyer of the products of the mining company, that's a channel which might help to produce certain pressure. The other question is, who is the company itself? I understood it's a Chinese mining company you were dealing with, right? So yes. That creates obviously another challenge, because obviously there is very little chance that you can mobilize any support in China, because China is a dictatorship, and the Chinese state trade unions are, well, they're not a workers' organization. They're an instrument of the state to govern the workers, right? So you have no counterpart there. So then what remains is to look at the customer. The other is to try to unify the unions. And then, I mean, I always feel that in the longer run, workers are not stupid. Even if they get presents and even if the the companies want them to elect for the yellow unions, the moment you can show over time the consistency of your work, there's a chance that when the vote comes, the workers know what is their own organization and what is a setup, right? So there's a whole bunch of elements where you can try to do things, but I can imagine it's an uphill battle you're in, right? So it's very easy to sit in cozy Germany and to give someone an advice down there, you know, what you could do. So I'm very reluctant really to say anything more there.
Thanks very much, Frank, and thanks, Charles, for that. I mean, we have very similar situation in Albania with the mine workers, extremely similar to that, and it's always hard, you know. On the one hand, we really supporting collective bargaining. On the other hand, it so much depends whether the unions sitting in the collective negotiations are really representing workers' interests. So a big issue there. Frank Lai came back with I think it's a kind of a follow-up question to what we had, and basically saying that the situation of workers in global value chains has been bad, particularly in the lower end of supply chains, has been bad for long, and COVID has made it even worse. So in few words, is there a possibility to that in this crisis period to push for an enforceable global agreement against labor market deregulation in supply chains? And what can still be done in that direction? And since we are towards the end, Frank, perhaps also in relation to the main topic that you presented earlier, what really needs to happen for such a proposal? I mean, you said you've shared it with the global trade unions, the proposal about EBA, but what will need to happen really, and what can be done by the different progressive forces in societies to push for that?
Well, let me start with your first question on COVID-19. I think COVID-19 disclosed the fragility of a lot of supply chains and the enormous suffering which it means, particularly for workers at the end of the global supply chain. I think Mark Anna, in his lecture at the beginning of the course, very well described how the whole house of cards came down in the supply chains. Whether that gives an opportunity to rethink this, I'm not sure, because in the first moment, the huge rise in unemployment shifts the balance of power a bit against workers, right? Because people are so desperate to get a job. There is an overcapacity now for certain products because the demand is much less than before. I rather would think that it's worth, again, following a bit the thoughts Niva and also I think Kjeld in his presentation made about that there might be other ways of industrial policy and development, not so much linked to global supply chains, than more to internal markets, which might open up opportunities because of COVID and a certain breakdown in the supply chains. Second point, what needs to happen? That's very difficult to say at Lira, but sometimes it takes some ideas to be around for a while, and suddenly then they get broader attention in the public debate. You might recall that for many years, the idea of a Tobin tax, a tax on trade in shares and stocks, was seen as absolutely a loony left idea which no one would follow. But then after the financial crisis, and when people looked again at it, there was a feeling, no, maybe we have to do something about regulating the financial markets. So the debate changed, right? So you have it also in some other issues where you find that constant debate creates openings for change. I think that's the same if we will have a discussion about due diligence laws in a number of countries. We had a discussion about that in France already, in Britain, in Germany, in the EU. And there will be an evaluation about development aid, which instruments do help and so on in that discussion. And in that discussion, I think unions need to make their voice heard. They have not, I think important thing for trade unions is we are always very good in saying what we don't like, right? And saying we're against this and this and this. And we are far less creative in saying we would suggest an alternative. And I think the proposal here has a bit of an idea to say, this is a bit of an alternative, how it can be done differently. And if we bring that into the debate, I think we can build allies with campaign groups, with civil society groups, with progressive politicians, and we might get some support for this, you know. There's no guarantee for this, but if I can conclude, I think it was 150 years ago when Karl Marx was saying, when an idea, you know, gets the imagination of the people, it becomes a material force. And I think that's what ideas is about, and this course is about. We produce ideas, and if we have enough people around thinking about it, bringing it forward, I think that's the first step to change. And I mean, Charles described how difficult even small change in his country is. So it's a big challenge, it's a big job, but I think that's what we are up to. We have to make sure that we have some ideas how change can happen.
Well, thank you very much for the positive note at the end of the conversation. If there is any burning question, please, we have a couple of minutes more. Otherwise, just giving a minute for people if they want to have any final question. But be sure that we will have these conversations in the future too in other courses coming up. So
yeah, I just have one thing. We don't have to discuss it now, but maybe Alira, you can set up that for another discussion. I think we would very much like to hear also and learn from you what you think about the way we are running these courses. Maybe next week we can have a bit of a chat, invite people and say, look, that's what we thought made sense in the course. That was that boring. And please don't torture us with that lecture again, or whatever you think was good or bad. I think that would be something, if I have a wish at the end of this lecture, where I would count on your feedback. Maybe we can organize something like that in a week's or 2 weeks' time.
Yes, we are hoping to have it actually next week. It's just that we've been sending so many messages this week to the course participants. And we're trying really to go step by step so people are not overwhelmed. But when we finish with the workshops this week, we most probably going to have another conversation, an announcement about another workshop to really discuss this course in more depth and more in terms of the methods, the different methods we engaged. Yeah, what Frank said, what was produced, how helpful it was, how it can be done better for the next courses. So I see there are no other questions. So for the future discussion, how does the use of blockchain technology affect garment supply chain technology? The follow-up, can unions and labor NGOs access this data? Okay, so that's for the next course, Gifford, or you want Frank to give any feedback now?
Next time.
Next time.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Thank you very much. Tomorrow we're going to have a conversation with Niva from South Africa. Thanks a lot, Frank, for the time and the very interesting conversation. And see you soon. Stay safe, wear a mask, and yeah, please complete the course and apply for a certificate. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.